Hello and welcome to Ancient History Hub. In the vast lands of Central Asia, where wide grasslands stretch far beyond the horizon, history has always moved with the wind. These lands are known as the steppes, enormous open plains where travelers can ride for days without seeing mountains or cities. For thousands of years, these plains were home to nomadic peoples. They lived in portable tents, traveled with their animals, and followed the changing seasons. Life on the steppe was both beautiful and harsh. The summers were warm and bright, with endless skies above golden grasslands. But the winters could be unforgiving. Cold winds swept across the plains, and survival depended on strength, skill, and community. In this environment, people learned to ride horses from an early age. Children could ride almost as soon as they could walk. Horses were not only companions, but also essential for travel, hunting, and war. Because of this, the people of the steppe became some of the most skilled riders and warriors in history. Centuries earlier, these lands had given rise to one of the greatest conquerors the world had ever known, Genghis Khan. Under his leadership, Mongol armies had spread across Asia and into Europe, creating an empire that stretched across continents. Cities fell before them, kingdoms disappeared, and trade routes connected distant civilizations. But no empire lasts forever. After the death of Genghis Khan and his successors, the great Mongol Empire slowly began to divide. Different regions became controlled by different rulers, and over time, the unity of the empire faded. By the 14th century, Central Asia had become a land of rival tribes and competing leaders. And it was into this world, a world shaped by ancient traditions, powerful warriors, and shifting alliances, that a boy named Timur was born. At the time, no one could have known that this boy would one day become one of the most powerful and feared rulers of his age. Timur was born around the year 1336 in a region known as Transoxiana. This land lay between two great rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, and it had long been an important crossroads of trade and culture. Caravans traveling along the Silk Road passed through this region, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and stories from distant lands. Timur belonged to a tribe called the Barlas. The Barlas people had once been part of the Mongol armies that followed Genghis Khan generations earlier. Over time, however, they had adopted many local customs. They spoke Turkic languages and followed the traditions of the region, blending Mongol heritage with Central Asian culture. Timur's family was not poor, but neither were they kings or emperors. His father was a respected tribal leader, and the family possessed land and animals. From an early age, Timur would have learned the skills expected of a young man on the steppe. He learned to ride horses with confidence and ease. He practiced archery, hunting, and the handling of weapons. He watched the older warriors and listened to stories about battles and great leaders. Life in Central Asia during this time was rarely peaceful. Rival tribes competed for land and influence, and small conflicts were common. For a young man growing up in such an environment, the path of a warrior was almost inevitable. Timur showed intelligence, ambition, and determination. Those who knew him in his youth likely saw that he possessed unusual confidence and leadership ability. But even then, few could have imagined how far his ambitions would eventually carry him. To understand Timur's rise, it is important to understand the world in which he lived. The people of the Central Asian steppe lived a nomadic lifestyle. Instead of building permanent cities, they moved from place to place with their herds of horses, sheep, and cattle. Their homes were portable tents known as yurts, circular structures made from wooden frames and covered with felt. These homes could be assembled or dismantled quickly, allowing entire communities to move when the seasons changed. Life followed a rhythm shaped by nature. In the spring and summer, the grasslands provided abundant grazing for animals. Families traveled across wide areas, searching for fresh pasture. During the colder months, they moved to more sheltered locations where animals could survive the winter. Because movement was constant, the horse became central to daily life. A skilled rider could travel vast distances in a single day. Warriors learned to shoot arrows while galloping at full speed, striking targets with remarkable accuracy. This lifestyle produced soldiers who were fast, disciplined, and incredibly mobile. It also created societies where loyalty, honor, and reputation were deeply important. Leaders were respected not only for their power, but also for their generosity and their ability to protect their people. These traditions would shape the young Timur and influence the way he would rule in the years to come. At some point during his early adulthood, Timur suffered an injury that would become famous throughout history. While the exact details remain uncertain, historical accounts suggest that he was wounded during a conflict or raid. The injury damaged his leg and possibly his hand, leaving him with a permanent limp. Because of this, he became known in some languages as Timur the Lame. The name eventually evolved into the word many people recognize today, Tamerlane. Despite this injury, Timur did not withdraw from the life of a warrior. Instead, he continued to lead soldiers and take part in campaigns. In fact, the injury may have strengthened his determination. Many great leaders throughout history have faced adversity early in life. Challenges can sometimes deepen a person's resolve, pushing them to prove themselves to the world. For Timur, this moment may have marked the beginning of an even greater ambition. He was no longer simply a tribal warrior. He was becoming a leader. During Timur's early years, Central Asia was politically unstable. The once unified Mongol territories had fragmented into smaller states ruled by competing leaders. Alliances formed and dissolved quickly, and power often changed hands through conflict. Timur began to build his reputation as a skilled military commander. He formed alliances with other leaders, gathered followers, and slowly increased his influence. Success in battle brought both wealth and loyalty. Victorious warriors attracted more supporters, and each new alliance strengthened Timur's position. Over time, he gained control of important territories and established his authority in the region. One of the most significant moments in his rise was the capture of the ancient city of Samarkand. Samarkand had long been one of the great cities of Central Asia. Located along the Silk Road, it was a center of trade, culture, and learning. When Timur made Samarkand his capital, it became the heart of his growing empire. From this city, he would plan campaigns that would reshape the political landscape of Asia. As Timur's authority in Central Asia became secure, his ambitions naturally began to grow beyond the lands of his early victories. The city of Samarkand had become the center of his power. From there, messengers traveled in all directions, carrying orders to distant commanders and reports from newly conquered territories. Samarkand itself slowly transformed into a magnificent capital. Traders arrived from Persia, India, and even distant China. Markets filled with fabrics, spices, metals, and works of art brought along the ancient routes of the Silk Road. But Timur was not a ruler who remained still for long. Throughout history, many leaders have built their strength by consolidating the lands they already control. Timur, however, believed that power must constantly move forward. Beyond Central Asia lay vast territories, rich kingdoms, ancient cities, and powerful rulers who had long governed their lands independently. To Timur, these regions represented both opportunity and challenge. He began organizing campaigns that would carry his armies across deserts, mountains, and fertile valleys. Timur's military strength rested largely on cavalry. His soldiers were expert riders who could travel long distances quickly. Many of them had grown up on the same steppe lands where Timur himself had spent his youth. They were accustomed to life on horseback and capable of enduring long journeys across difficult terrain. The structure of Timur's army reflected traditions that had existed on the steppe for generations. Units were organized with careful discipline. Commanders were chosen not only for their loyalty, but also for their ability to lead in battle. Communication across the battlefield was often carried through banners, drums, and signals that could be understood even amid the noise and confusion of combat. As Timur expanded his campaigns westward and southward, many cities faced an important choice. Some leaders chose to submit peacefully and recognize Timur's authority. In such cases, they were often allowed to remain in power as local rulers, provided they paid tribute and supported Timur's campaigns. Other cities chose resistance, and when resistance occurred, the consequences could be severe. Historical accounts describe Timur's campaigns as both highly organized and deeply destructive. Cities that opposed him sometimes faced long sieges, and when they fell, their populations could suffer greatly. Yet at the same time, Timur viewed himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order and power in lands that had become divided and unstable. This mixture of ambition, strategy, and harsh punishment created a reputation that spread far beyond the regions he directly controlled. Merchants traveling along the Silk Road carried stories of Timur's victories to distant lands. Travelers spoke of an army that moved swiftly across continents. They spoke of a ruler who could appear unexpectedly at the gates of a distant city. And gradually, the name of Timur began to inspire both fear and fascination across Asia. One of the regions that would soon feel the full strength of Timur's campaigns was Persia. Persia had long been one of the great cultural centers of the world. Its cities contained libraries, mosques, markets, and gardens that had flourished for centuries. But by the late 14th century, Persia itself was divided among several competing rulers. For Timur, this division represented an opportunity. His armies began moving into Persian territory, capturing important cities and establishing control across large regions. Although many battles were fought, Timur also understood the value of skilled administrators, scholars, and artisans. When cities surrendered, he sometimes ordered that craftsmen, architects, and scholars be relocated to Samarkand. In this way, the capital of his empire slowly became a gathering place for knowledge, art, and culture from across the lands he conquered. Samarkand's mosques grew larger and more elaborate. Gardens and palaces were constructed. Decorative tiles and intricate patterns covered the walls of new buildings. Visitors to the city would later describe its beauty and grandeur with admiration. Thus, Timur's empire grew in two different ways at the same time. On the battlefield, his armies expanded the borders of his power, and within his capital, the wealth and knowledge of many cultures were brought together to create something new. As the years passed, Timur continued leading campaigns across vast distances. He traveled with his armies through deserts where the air shimmered with heat. He crossed mountain passes where narrow roads wound between towering peaks, and he rode across plains where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction. Despite the immense distances involved, Timur maintained careful control over his forces. Messengers traveled constantly between units, ensuring that plans were coordinated and movements remained organized. Such logistical skill was one of the reasons his campaigns proved so successful. But even the most powerful conqueror cannot remain in motion forever. As Timur grew older, his empire had already reached an extraordinary size. Yet his ambitions had not entirely faded. There were still distant lands that lay beyond the borders of his realm, and in the mind of Timur, new campaigns were always possible. As the years passed, the empire of Timur stretched across enormous distances. From the deserts of Persia to the mountains of Central Asia, his influence reached cities that had existed for centuries before his rise. Caravans traveling along ancient trade routes carried news of his campaigns from one kingdom to another. Merchants spoke of the power of his armies. Travelers told stories of the magnificent city of Samarkand, and rulers in distant lands listened carefully whenever Timur's name appeared in conversation. Despite his growing age, Timur remained an active leader. Unlike some rulers who governed from palaces, he continued to travel with his armies and personally oversee many of his campaigns. The life of a steppe warrior had shaped him from childhood, and even after decades of power, he seemed most comfortable when moving across open landscapes. His camps were often set up on wide plains beneath vast skies. Thousands of soldiers would gather around fires at night, while horses rested nearby after long days of travel. In those quiet evenings, the atmosphere in the camp could sometimes feel almost peaceful. The sound of wind moving across the grasslands, the distant movement of horses, the low voices of soldiers speaking softly around fires. These moments of calm were rare in the life of a conqueror, yet they formed an important rhythm in the daily life of Timur's armies. While Timur continued his campaigns, his capital city grew into something remarkable. Samarkand had long been an important city along the Silk Road, but under Timur it began to transform into one of the most impressive cities of the medieval world. Caravans arrived from many directions. From Persia came merchants carrying carpets, metals, and fine pottery. From India came spices and precious stones. From China came silk and delicate porcelain. The markets of Samarkand became filled with languages, colors, and cultures from across Asia. Architects and craftsmen were brought to the city to construct new buildings that reflected the growing prestige of the empire. Large mosques rose above the city skyline, decorated with intricate tiles of blue and turquoise. Beautiful gardens were planted within palace walls. Fountains flowed quietly in shaded courtyards. Scholars gathered in libraries to copy manuscripts and discuss ideas from distant civilizations. Visitors to Samarkand often wrote about its beauty. Some described walking through wide courtyards where the sunlight reflected from polished tiles. Others remembered the sound of water moving gently through palace gardens. In many ways, Samarkand represented the other side of Timur's legacy. While his armies expanded the empire through war, his capital became a center of art, architecture, and learning. The lands controlled by Timur were connected by ancient trade routes that had existed long before his time. These routes formed part of what historians call the Silk Road. For centuries, travelers had moved along these paths, carrying goods, knowledge, and stories between civilizations. Under Timur's rule, these roads continued to function as important links between cultures. Caravans moved slowly across deserts and mountains. At night, travelers rested beside fires beneath star-filled skies. The journey across Central Asia was never easy. Long stretches of land offered little shelter from the elements, but those who completed the journey could reach cities filled with opportunity. Merchants, scholars, and adventurers all traveled these roads, connecting distant regions of the world. Even in the later years of his life, Timur's ambitions had not disappeared. Many rulers, after building large empires, eventually choose to spend their final years in comfort, surrounded by palaces, gardens, and the wealth they have accumulated. But Timur had lived almost his entire life in motion. From his youth on the steppe, he had become accustomed to travel, campaigns, and the constant movement of armies across vast landscapes. For a man like him, remaining still for too long may have felt unnatural. Even as the years passed and his empire stretched across enormous territories, Timur continued to think about new challenges and distant lands. One of those lands was China. For centuries, China had been one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. Its cities were immense, its population vast, and its culture rich with traditions that had developed over thousands of years. To rulers across Asia, China represented both wealth and prestige. Earlier in history, the armies of Genghis Khan and his descendants had conquered large parts of China and established the Yuan dynasty. But by Timur's time, the political situation had changed. The Yuan dynasty had fallen, and a new Chinese dynasty had taken control. The Ming dynasty. The rulers of the Ming Empire had worked to restore stability and strengthen their borders after the end of Mongol rule. Yet the lands of Central Asia and China had always been connected by the ancient roads of trade and diplomacy. Caravans traveled between these worlds, carrying silk, spices, ceramics, and stories of distant kingdoms. Through these travelers, news of Timur's growing empire eventually reached the courts of China, and through similar channels, Timur himself would have learned about the wealth and power of the Chinese state. For a conqueror who had already defeated many rulers across Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East, the idea of a campaign toward China may have seemed like the final great challenge of his life. It was not simply a military ambition, it was also a symbolic one. A successful campaign toward China would place Timur among the greatest conquerors of history. Preparations for such an expedition were not simple. China lay far to the east, separated by long distances, deserts, mountains, and difficult terrain. Any army traveling in that direction would need careful planning. Supplies had to be gathered. Horses had to be prepared. Commanders had to organize their forces and ensure that thousands of soldiers could travel together across challenging landscapes. Messengers moved across the empire carrying instructions to regional leaders. Armies began gathering in different locations, preparing for what might become one of the largest campaigns of Timur's life. The atmosphere during these preparations must have been filled with both excitement and uncertainty. Veteran soldiers who had fought in earlier campaigns likely understood how demanding such a journey could become. Younger warriors may have felt a sense of anticipation, eager to take part in what could become a legendary expedition. Across the vast camps of Timur's army, life continued in its familiar rhythm. Horses were groomed and fed, weapons were repaired and sharpened. Tents were arranged across wide plains where soldiers rested beneath open skies. At night, campfires glowed softly across the landscape. Groups of warriors gathered around the fires, sharing food and conversation. Some may have spoken about past battles and distant lands they had seen. Others may have quietly wondered what challenges awaited them on the road toward China. For Timur himself, these preparations represented the continuation of a life spent pursuing power, influence, and legacy. He had spent decades shaping the map of Central Asia. Now, even in the final years of his life, he still looked toward the horizon. Yet history often moves in ways that no leader can fully control. While the armies prepared and plans took shape, time itself continued its quiet course, and soon events would unfold that would prevent this final ambition from ever becoming a reality. In the winter of 1405, while preparing for the campaign, Timur became ill. The weather during that season was harsh. Cold winds swept across the steppe, and travel conditions were difficult. Despite the efforts of physicians and attendants, his condition worsened. After decades of conquest, leadership, and ambition, Timur's life came to an end during this final campaign. His body was taken back to Samarkand, the city that had become the heart of his empire. There he was buried in a magnificent mausoleum. Today that tomb remains one of the most famous historical monuments in Central Asia. After the death of Timur, the empire he had created began to change. Like many empires built by powerful individuals, it depended heavily on the authority of its founder. Without his leadership, different regions gradually came under the control of various successors. Some of Timur's descendants continued to rule important territories. Over time, their influence spread into new regions. One of the most famous descendants would eventually found the Mughal Empire in India centuries later. Through this lineage, Timur's legacy continued to shape history long after his lifetime. The life of Timur remains one of the most fascinating stories of the medieval world. Some historians remember him as a brilliant military strategist. Others focus on the destruction that followed many of his campaigns. History often presents powerful figures in complicated ways. Great leaders can leave behind both achievements and tragedies. Timur's empire reshaped the political landscape of Central Asia and the Middle East. At the same time, the cultural achievements of Samarkand left a lasting mark on architecture and art. Centuries later, the buildings constructed during his rule still stand as reminders of that era. If we return once more to the vast steppes of Central Asia, we can imagine the world where Timur's story began. The grasslands move gently in the wind. Horses graze quietly across the plains. The horizon stretches endlessly beneath a wide sky. Long before cities and empires appeared, these lands were already shaped by the rhythms of nature. And long after the rise and fall of rulers, the steppe continues to exist in the same quiet way. Travelers who cross these lands today may still feel the same sense of space and silence that riders experienced centuries ago. The wind moves softly across the grass. The sky grows darker as evening approaches, and the story of Timur slowly fades into the distant past. Yet history remains alive in the landscapes where it once unfolded, and in the quiet stillness of the steppe, it is easy to imagine the echoes of riders who once crossed these plains long ago. Perhaps, if one were standing there at dusk, watching the last light of the sun disappear behind distant hills, the land itself might seem almost timeless. The same winds that move across the grass today once carried the sounds of horses, distant voices, and the quiet movement of traveling caravans. The steppe remembers these moments in silence, and as night slowly settles over the plains, the stars begin to appear one by one above the darkening horizon, just as they did centuries ago, when riders guided their horses across these same endless lands beneath the quiet sky.